Wacky Wednesday.
From a murderer that sliced up and cooked his victims, to a killer that butchered hundreds of women in Peru, we count 20 of the worst serial killers ever. Number 20. Randy Stephen Kraft. Born March 19th, 1945, Randy Stephen Kraft is an American serial killer known as the scorecard killer or the freeway killer, who committed the rape, torture, mutilation, and murder of at least 16 young men in a series of killings spanning between 1972 and 1983, the majority of which were committed in California. Kraft became known as the scorecard killer because upon his arrest, investigators discovered a coded list depicting cryptic references to his victims, and the freeway killer because many of his victims' bodies were discovered beside or close to freeways. Number 19. Jeffrey Dahmer. One of the most infamous murderers, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered at least 17 men and boys between the years 1978 and 1991. His murders were quite gruesome, involving acts of forced sodomy, necrophilia, dismemberment, and cannibalism. Dahmer committed his first murder when he was 18 years old, killing Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old hitchhiker. In 1988, he was arrested for sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy in Milwaukee, which he served 10 months of a 1-year sentence in a work release camp. However, in 1988, there was not yet a law requiring offenders to register when convicted of a sex crime against a minor. He convinced the judge that he needed therapy and was released with a 5-year probation on good behavior. Number 18. William George Bonin. William George Bonin was an American serial killer and twice paroled sex offender who committed the rape, torture, and murder of at least 21 boys and young men in a series of killings between 1979 and 1980 in Southern California. He was convicted of 14 of these murders and subsequently executed in 1996. William George Bonin also became known as the freeway killer due to the fact that the majority of his victims' bodies were discovered alongside numerous freeways in Southern California. Number 17. Ronald Joseph Dominique. Ronald Joseph Dominique is an American serial killer from Louisiana. Dominique was investigated in late 2006 following a police report by a man who refused to let Dominique tie him up. Following his arrest on December 1st, 2006, Dominique confessed to the rape and murder of at least 23 men over a 10-year period beginning in 1997 in New Orleans. His reason for murdering these men was to avoid prison. Having raped the men, he thought it would be better to kill them than to have them report the assault to the police. Eventually, he was charged with multiple cases of rape and first-degree murder. Number 16. Juan VALLEJO Corona. Juan VALLEJO Corona is a Mexican serial killer imprisoned in the United States. He was convicted of the 1971 murders of 25 laborers, men who had been found buried in shallow graves in the orchard of fruit ranches in Sutter County, California, where they did seasonal harvesting and other thinning jobs. At that time, these gruesome crimes represented the worst and most notorious serial murders in US history. Corona was sentenced in 1973 to 25 life sentences. His second trial in 1982 failed to render an acquittal and he was returned to prison to serve out his sentence. Number 15. Dean Arnold CORLL. Dean Arnold CORLL was an American serial killer who, with 2 young accomplices named David Brooks and Alma Wayne Henley Jr., abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 28 boys in a series of killings spanning from 1970 to 1973 in Houston, Texas. The crimes, which became known as the Houston Mass Murders, came to light only after Henley fatally shot CORLL. CORLL was also known as the Candyman or the Pied Piper. This is because he and his family had owned and operated a candy factory in Houston Heights, and he had been known to give free candy to the local children. At the time of their discovery, the Houston Mass Murderers were considered the worst example of serial murder in American history. Number 14. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous serial killers in US history. Bundy raped and murdered scores of women across the United States between 1974 and 1978. After more than a decade of vigorous denials, Bundy eventually confessed to 30 murders, although the actual total of victims remains unknown. Typically, Bundy would rape and then murder his victims by bludgeoning and sometimes by strangulation. He also engaged in necrophilia, and sometimes Bundy would even impersonate authority figures such as a policeman in order to win over potential victims. Number 13. Wayne Williams. Thought to be responsible for the infamous Atlanta child murders that took place in Atlanta, Georgia, between the years 1979 and 1981. Williams was actually convicted of the murder of two adult men, 29-year-old Jimmy Payne and 27-year-old Nathaniel Carter. It was after his arrest and subsequent conviction that local authorities were able to apparently solve the majority of the 29 child murders that took place in the area, although he still protests his innocence to this day. Number 12. John Wayne Gacy. Known as the Killer Clown, John Wayne Gacy was one of the most notorious serial killers in history. He was caught assaulting two teenage boys sexually and then was sentenced to 10 years in jail. Although, due to his excellent behavior as an inmate, he was released on parole. As the years went by, he enjoyed dressing up as Pogo the Clown and started volunteering at parties and parades. Behind the costume was the person who killed 33 young men, burying their bodies in his backyard, house, and the river nearby. After he was arrested, the authorities found bones in his house, forcing him to confess to all the murders. Number 11. Moses Sithole. South Africa's most infamous serial killer and perpetrator of what were known as the ABC murders. Due to the fact that he started, continued, and finished in towns starting with the letters A, B, and C. He would lead his victims out onto deserted fields under false pretenses where he would then overpower them, rape them, and then murder them. After his capture in 1995 and then conviction in 1997, he was sentenced to 2,410 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 930 years. Number 10. GERALD STANO. GERALD STANO was an American that started to kill around the late 1960s to early 1970s and continued on for as many as 8 years. Stano picked up a number of hitchhikers and young women, murdering them via shooting, stabbing, or strangulation. Although he was apprehended in 1980 and he was sentenced to life in prison until his execution by electric chair in Florida in 1998. Number 9. ANDREI CHIKATILO, a notorious Ukrainian serial murderer, as well as being a chronic bedwetter suffering from impotence. CHIKATILO earned himself such titles as the Ripper of Rostov, the Rostov Ripper, and the Butcher of Rostov, after the area in which the murders were committed. A sexual deviant, CHIKATILO was only able to achieve orgasm by stabbing and slashing his victims, rather than outwardly raping them. Active from the late 1970s all the way through to the early 1990s, he was apprehended and interrogated by police and sentenced to death. A sentence that was carried out in 1994 by gunshot to the head. He was 57 at the time. Number 8. Bruno LUDKE. His killings spanned 15 years, starting in 1928. LUDKE was caught near the end of World War II by Nazi police, after they allegedly discovered him committing necrophilia on the corpse of one of his recently deceased victims. He subsequently confessed to a number of crimes and was declared insane. He was then sent to hospital in Vienna where he was subjected to medical experiments which resulted in his death by lethal injection in 1944. Number 7. Gary Ridgeway. Ridgeway would later become known as the Green River Killer, due to his propensity for dumping bodies in the Green River in Washington. His killing spree in the 1980s would result in him becoming one of the most prolific serial murderers in American history. He would abduct runaways or prostitutes and murder them after sexually assaulting them. Ridgeway was convicted in 2001 for murders that he had committed 20 years previously, and this was only down to a breakthrough in DNA evidence linking him to his victims. Ridgeway would later go on to say that murdering young women was his career. Number 6. Henry Lee Lucas. Originally confessing to thousands of murders with his accomplice, Otis Toole, police then subsequently attributed roughly 213 murder cases to his name, although only 4 were ever proven to have been committed by him. one of which included his own abusive mother. He was apprehended in 1983 and then was sentenced to death, but bizarrely enough, his sentence was then commuted to life in prison by then Governor George W. Bush. Lucas died of natural causes in 2001, aged 64, taking the true number of how many crimes he committed to the grave. Number 5. Daniel Camargo Barbosa. Daniel was a Colombian psychopathic serial killer, and it's believed that he raped and killed over 150 young girls in Colombia and Ecuador during the 1970s and 80s. Camargo's mother died when he was a little boy, and his father was overbearing and emotionally distant. So he was raised by an abusive stepmother who punished him and sometimes dressed him in girls' clothing, making him a victim of ridicule in front of his peers. This was, most probably without a doubt, one of the reasons why he killed later in life. Number 4. Gilles de Reyes. Gilles de Reyes, a French nobleman, is considered to be the precursor to the modern serial killer. He was accused and ultimately convicted of torturing, raping, and murdering dozens, if not hundreds, of young children, mainly boys. He and his accomplices would then set up the severed heads of the children in order to judge which was the most fair. The precise number of de Reyes' victims is not known, as most of the bodies were burnt or buried. Number 3. Javed Iqbal. Javed Iqbal was a serial killer from Pakistan. He claimed he killed 100 boys during an 18-month period. He had been arrested in June 1998 for sexually abusing 2 boys for money. He then got off on bail and began murdering boys shortly after. Iqbal would find boys on the street, charm them into his confidence, and then drug them, rape them, and then strangle them. He would then cut the bodies up into pieces and put them in barrels filled with hydrochloric acid, and once all of the remains were liquefied, he would then dump them. Number 2. Luis Alfredo Garavito CUBILLOS, also known as The Beast, is a Colombian rapist and serial killer. In 1999, he admitted to the rape and murder of 147 young boys. The number of victims, based on the locations of the skeletons listed on maps he drew in prison, could eventually exceed 300. He has been described by local media as the world's worst serial killer because of the high number of victims. Once captured, Garavito was subject to the maximum penalty available in Colombia, which was 30 years. Number 1. Pedro Alonso Lopez. By far one of the most prolific serial killers of all time. Nicknamed the Monster of the Andes, butchered enough people to fill a small town. After killing around 100 tribal women in Peru in the 1970s, he was apprehended by tribal forces that were just about ready to execute him, when they were convinced by an American missionary that was staying with them at the time to take him to the police force instead. Unfortunately, the police just let him go, after which Lopez traveled to Ecuador, where he proceeded to kill about 3 to 4 girls per week. This carried on until he was caught in 1980. He was then released in 1998, deporting him to Colombia. Lopez allegedly said that he was being released for good behavior.